Thank you for the opportunity to chat here. And I think the timing of my presentation is very good because Fiona has just raised a whole bunch of the issues, which means that I can flip through a lot of this a lot quicker. So I think as Fiona has just highlighted, I think the one thing that everyone is starting to understand now is if the world has any chance to meet the kind of climate goals, to stick below 2 degrees or stick below 1.5 degrees, the transition to a low carbon economy is going to have to start now. It should actually have started already, but it really, the time is running out, so the policy response, if it's going to happen, it needs to happen now. And also already been highlighted, that creates risks in terms of stranded assets. It basically requires a complete reorganization of economies, and how we produce and how we consume. And shareholders and asset owners have started to wisen up to this, and to the potential implications of this. Again, Fiona, thank you for the introduction. But as you say, where we are now, based on current pledges, we're not getting anywhere near 1.5 degrees. It's just not happening. Best case, we're kind of looking for about double that. Which again, in South Africa, as you heard from the first presentation, South Africa warms at about double the international average. So 3 degrees internationally is 6 degrees in South Africa. 6 degrees in South Africa means there's no more unirrigated wheat production in South Africa. So it's really a very scary prospect. The good news is public opinion is starting to harden on this issue. Politicians are starting to take notice. You have climate emergency, the climate strikes. You have a whole bunch of countries now starting to sign up to be carbon neutral by 2050, which is all great. But what that means, in order to meet that, we're going to need a more rapid policy response. So transition risk becomes more of an issue, not less of an issue, because we've delayed. There's also some good news in all of this. I mean, 10 years ago when I was going around doing a lot of policy work trying to convince people about the importance of all of this, the policy response internationally was very weak. So this is based on World Bank information. In 2009, there was like a scattering of climate pricing initiatives around the world. Now in 2019, the bulk of emissions internationally is covered by some form of carbon pricing, be it at a national level or being at a subnational level. And even where this isn't in place, people are thinking about it, so it's coming. And what that effectively means is we're starting to internalize the cost of the climate change externality. So the whole idea of being able to emit freely and then just, the costs are coming in future and other people will carry it, so we don't really care, that's changing. Through mitigation policy, it's going to become costly to emit carbon in future. So the greenhouse gas emissions basically now becomes a factor of production. And this is going to impact, it's going to impact relative cost structures, competitiveness, the whole way companies operate and who's competitive and who's not is going to change. So for some companies, the ones that are lucky, they'll just face reduced cash flows because of mitigation costs or carbon costs. A bunch of other companies are going to see their markets disappear. It's either going to be captured by lower carbon providers, or they're simply not going to be markets anymore. Some things are just not going to exist. And it used to be 20, 30, 40 years. Now we're starting to look at transition risk of the time frame of 2030, which is 10 and a bit years away. So these risks have really moved closer. And I'm not going to bore you with the details of the TCFD because that's very nicely been explained by Fiona. But what that has done is suddenly there's a language around transition risk. Because up until quite recently, it was all about the physical impacts of climate change that people were worried about. Now there's language that also helps us think about the transition risks. So in this move to a low carbon economy, what does that mean for companies? What does that mean for portfolios, for asset owners? So this now stands along physical risk as something to think about. And an interesting, there's an interesting interplay between the two. Because the higher the more mitigation you get, the lower climate change you get, lower level of climate change, the lower degrees, actually the transition risk increases because you need a more forceful policy response to have a smaller increase in emissions. So effectively, if your policy, your physical risk in future goes down, well, your transition risk in the short term, now, today, is actually increasing. And also the point's already been made, these things are complicated to think about. They're not easy. But what the TCFD has done is, and just through the document itself and the thinking, but also through a number of pilots, is there are methodologies starting to appear about how to actually deal with these issues. So how do you quantify, and the whole point of the TCFD is, as was already mentioned, is taking these risks and these impacts and translating them into information that's useful in terms of asset allocation. Taking the kind of broad risks and making it rands and cents, that so you can see what happens to income statements, what happens to cash flow statements and balance sheets and so on. So as I said, and unfortunately it's not an easy thing to think about. It's getting easier, but there's a lot of uncertainties in terms of transition risk. As I've already mentioned one, so the largest driving force really is what scenario are you looking at? So what kind of policy response is driving mitigation? Because the more forceful the policy response, the higher the degree of transition risk. But then there's also different time frames. Sectors are impacted differently. Companies within sectors are impacted differently. So it's not an easy thing to think about. And I think, as was already mentioned for a long time, that's why people weren't thinking about it. But the evidence now is starting to become very clear. I mean, climate change risks and particularly transition risks in the shorter term, this is going to influence returns. So it's no longer an issue about is there a fiduciary duty or not. I think my perspective is very clear. There's more and more evidence that this will impact returns, and it's going to start doing it a lot sooner than we thought. I'm not going to talk you through all these. What I'm showing now is just a few examples of work that's already being done internationally. So just to show you that people are doing the calculations and they're coming to conclusions. So this example is one of the TCFD pilots that looked at asset managers, and under a 1.5 degree policy scenario. So we have policies in place that limits climate change to 1.5 degrees. You're looking at potentially a 13.6% reduction in the value of the 30,000 largest listed companies in the world in the next 15 years. So it's not 2050, 2021 anymore. We're talking about 2030 in that scenario. And as part of that work, what's also come out very clearly is the longer you delay the policy response, the more intense it has to be, the quicker these changes has to happen, and the more risk there is, the larger the transition risk becomes, the larger the cost becomes. And as with all climate change issues, it impacts different sectors in different ways. And also, this is some work done by Mercer internationally. It impacts all asset classes in all markets. And so it really is a very broad, very all-encompassing issue to think about. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very important that you pick the right scenario, because under a 4 degrees, transition risk, it's okay. Obviously, you're loading up a whole bunch of physical risk for the future if you're playing at 4 degrees, which, shall I emphasize again, is 8 degrees in South Africa, which is pretty much catastrophic. So it's important to consider the right policy response. And also, so in the US, there's a lot of work being done, and this is just one example of looking at the impact on the portfolios of public defined benefit pension funds in the UK. And again, the numbers aren't as important, but the fact is literally each one of their assets that they invest in is expected to be impacted by this. And then we almost talked about the Netherlands in the wrong context, but a lot of work's been done in the Netherlands looking at systemic risk. So that, and again, this is transition risk, and they define it slightly differently from the TCFD, but it's still the same context. Now, I don't think I need to explain to anyone that if you're talking about transition risk, South Africa is disproportionately impacted. I mean, when it comes to, it's not always good being a leader, but when it comes to carbon intensity, we are a leader. So we are and not just that, we're very carbon intensive, but also we're very far from our main markets. So you also have transport emissions and all those kind of things that you also have to worry about. Never mind the emissions. Sounds like I've got music. I've got musical accompaniment there. Okay, maybe that's the mic. So yeah, and also a lot of work's been done work's starting to be done in South Africa, looking at the actual where does the risk sit and so forth. So that slide is from the Climate Policy Initiative, and again, the numbers are huge in terms of transition risk, and they're only looking at the most vulnerable sectors. So they're looking at the kind of most obvious, your kind of liquid fuels, coal, and so forth. Given the carbon intensity of our electricity supply, I mean, pretty much any sector in South Africa, anywhere else in the world, would be considered, exposed to transition risk. And yeah, again, some of the Climate Policy Initiative numbers. I mean, we can see this risk already in the portfolios, in South African asset portfolios. It becomes even more complicated when they sit in a kind of public sector related portfolios, because that risk essentially becomes public sector risk. I mean, no one is really expecting the PIC to and the GEPF to become, if things go wrong there, I think we all know where the buck's going to stop. So then, and also we're seeing, again, I think we've got a nice example of transition risk in South Africa. So South Africa, I mean, it was mentioned earlier, the world's been thinking about climate change for a long time. South Africa's been thinking about climate change, also not quite as long as the world, but also, it was one of the early movers. So in 2000, our current trajectory, our current global commitment, the people that decline trajectory, was first mentioned in 2009. It was defined in 2011 when the climate change white paper came out. In 2015, it became, part of South Africa's official commitment to the UNFCCC. So in 2019, large African banks started to realize, oh, you know what? Coal IPPs aren't really consistent with actually meeting the IPP. Well, congratulations. You should have picked this up in 2009. So again, the tools are out there. Like there's a lot of work being done in South Africa on transition and transition, but also a just transition, which I don't think I've got time to go into now. But the information is there. It's just a case of finding it, putting it in a format that's useful, in order to influence decision making. So I'm not going to talk through this whole slide, but all I'm trying to show you here is, look, there is methodologies for doing this stuff. In South Africa, we've got our peak plate decline trajectory. We've also, a lot of work's been, or not a lot, some work has been done in terms of which pathways will South Africa follow in order to get to that, to state a PPD. And depending on which one you pick, the kind of structure of the economy looks quite different. So it's important to understand not just what the targets are in South Africa, but what is the policy response going to look like? Where are people going to target where's the public sector going to target the policy instruments, and where can people respond? And then it's just a case of obviously looking at the vulnerability in terms of your portfolio. It's also a step in trying to figure out what's vulnerability and what's an actual risk, because there are ways of dealing with some of the transition risks. Depending on your market structure, I mean, if you can pass on your carbon costs, it's good from an investor perspective, not necessarily from the from society's perspective, but then you're less exposed. So there are ways of doing this, and essentially this is what the TCFD is starting to require. Is first you start with your qualitative disclosure, which literally is just a snapshot of how you're thinking about this, how are you doing this. But some companies are going further, and they're actually disclosing the kind of the climate value at risk in their portfolios. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's very doable. So again, I think it's doable and it's necessary. And the important thing is in South Africa, as I said, a lot of policy work has been done that can actually be translated into useful tools for the asset management industry. And just on the issue of transition risk, just a last kind of throwaway comment, which isn't really related to any of this. In South Africa, we're fortunate in that we've got pretty much some of the best conditions for renewable energy in the world. So actually, the worst solar conditions in South Africa is better than the best conditions in Germany. And we all know what's happened in the German example in terms of what they've done in terms of renewables. So the flip side of that is people are starting to think about how to deal with the just transition. And there is a school of thought that actually what you should do is you should just put some of these renewables where the old coal plants were and where the old coal mines were. Yes, they're not the optimal ones. You're losing a few points in return, but you can deal with these social issues, and you're still getting solar plants that have better economics than in Germany. Thank you very much.
Thanks,